Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to talk about the development of face. I am Dr. Farah Ghaus, Associate Professor in Department of Anatomy. The learning objectives for today's class, uh, as you can see, is by the end of the class, the learner should know the development of face. Uh, Here, this is a side view of the developing embryo where you can appreciate two bulgings. Cranial one is the developing forebrain and the caudal one is the developing pericardium. In between the two bulgings, there is stomodium separated from the outside by the buccopharyngeal membrane. Now, this developing forebrain develops a hook-like projection on the ventral aspect. This is known as frontonasal prominence. Now, this prominence and the process are one and the same thing. Some write it as process and some write it as prominence. So the formation of face begins with um, five facial prominences. One is frontonasal prominence and two maxillary and two mandibular prominences. They are the paired ones, whereas the frontonasal is unpaired. This begins at the end of the fourth week. And this frontonasal prominence develops a local thickening of the surface ectoderm that is known as nasal placoid. These nasal placoids invaginate in the midline or in the center to form nasal pits, and this nasal pit on both the sides is surrounded by a ridge of tissue that is known as the nasal prominence. Now, this nasal prominence divides into two. You can see yellow and blue color. Yellow ones are the medial nasal prominences, again paired, and blue ones are the lateral nasal prominences. They merge together, that is, the medial nasal prominences merge together when the maxillary prominences increase in size and compress the medial nasal prominences. Now, this medial nasal prominences, along with the maxillary prominences, they fuse to form the upper lip. Here you can see the center and the lateral parts. Orange one is the maxillary prominence and the yellow one is the medial nasal prominences. So these medial nasal prominences, they form the philtrum of the upper lip, whereas the maxillary prominences, they both form the lateral part of the upper lip on either sides. And the take-home message, as you can see, is the face develops from five facial prominences: frontonasal, two maxillary, and two mandibular. Whereas the upper lip is formed from medial nasal as well as the maxillary prominences. Thank you. Have a good day. Dear students, good morning. Today we are going to talk about the development of palate. Uh, Palate basically is made up of two components: primary palate and the secondary palate. As you can see here, the structure of palate is made up of two components: the primary palate and the secondary palate. Now, this primary palate is basically formed from the intermaxillary segment. This intermaxillary segment is basically the medial growth of maxillary prominences, which causes the two medial nasal prominences to merge not only at the surface but also at a deeper level. So this intermaxillary segment is basically composed of three components. One is the labial component that forms the philtrum of the upper lip. Then there is an upper jaw component which carries four incisor teeth. A palatal component that forms the triangular primary palate. Now, this intermaxillary segment is continuous with the rostral portion of the nasal septum that is formed by the frontal prominence. As you can see here in the diagram, it's the intermaxillary segment. This intermaxillary segment is carrying three components. One is the philtrum of the upper lip, then there are four incisor teeth, and the rest of the primary palate, triangular primary palate. Now, this triangular intermaxillary segment fuses with the secondary palate to form the palate as a whole. Now the secondary palate basically is made up of two palatine shelves. That is the maxillary prominences, as you can see here in the diagram. This is the maxillary prominence and the other maxillary prominence on either side, and these maxillary prominences give rise to a shelf-like projection towards the midline, where these two shelf-like projections they fuse with each other and with the primary palate. Now, palatine shelves they appear at 6th week of intrauterine life, and they are directed obliquely downwards on each side of the tongue. By the end of the 7th week, these palatine shelves they ascend up to attain a horizontal position above the tongue, forming the secondary palate. So here you can see the palate as a whole. This is the triangular primary palate which forms the premaxilla, and these palatine shelves on either side they fuse with each other and with the primary palate in a triangular manner. So this incisive foramen is the demarcating line between the primary and the secondary palate, and the nasal septum that grows from above down fuses with the cephalic aspect of the newly formed palate. That is all about the development of palate.